It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up.
Good morning. I'm delighted to have a conversation with two incredible women today. May I welcome on stage Ingrid and Julia. Great. So why sustainable organization will outperform in the future? Really exciting topic. We want to delve deeper. We've got half an hour. No time for questions, but we'll try to answer with some strategic questions. And I would love to start by having you to introduce yourself. Ingrid, if that's okay, we'll start with you and then move over to Julia.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I head Impact and Sustainable Investing for Federated Hermes. We are an US, UK-based asset manager with 770 billion of assets under management. But in addition to that, we also advise on 1.4 trillion assets, and we have actually invented what today is known as engagement with corporates. My particular area of interest is impact and biodiversity, and I'm responsible for all the portfolios as well as the thought leadership around these topics.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Julia. I actually was here already in 2022 at the GREENTECH Festival, so very happy to be back. I'm the co-founder of a company called Tidal Impact, and so we advise organizations from small startups to large private equity firms and corporations on how they can integrate sustainability and impact into their businesses by supporting them with their investment strategies and communication reporting. And I've also actually always been an entrepreneur myself. Besides building companies, I've built a global network of, I think now over 1,000 founders worldwide, young founders working on climate tech, education, healthcare, etc., all very impact driven in 31 countries who have raised over $2 billion in capital just in the last few years. And so actually through the interactions with all of these founders, I have realized that there is so much that we need to do to support these innovations and technologies to be adopted in the market, and also to get the corporates and the larger organizations to be up to speed when it comes to these topics and to collaborate together. And so, yeah, very happy to be here.
Fantastic. Welcome. So let's start by setting up the scene. And how would you define sustainability in the context of business operations? And perhaps if you can go a little bit deeper and tell us, from your point of view, how organizations can embrace sustainability as a core risk management tool.
People usually think that it's something very complex, but actually it's pretty simple. Embracing sustainability means that the company is actually taking into account and mitigating all of the adverse social and environmental factors, both in their operations and in their solutions. And why this is important is twofold. The first one is that it helps preserve value, especially the future value, given how the market is evolving in terms of regulation, in terms of the trends, and we can talk about that a bit later as well. But also it takes into account all stakeholders. So it's not only about the shareholders and shareholders making money. It's actually thinking about your employees, about your end customers, about your supply chain.
That's great. Thank you, Julia.
Yeah, and so I'm a big fan of this definition, which is about companies operating in a way that meets the current or today's needs in an economic, social, environmental way, but also that doesn't compromise on the ability of future generations to be able to meet such needs. And I think often when we hear people talk about climate or sustainability, it's about the motivation to have their children and the children of their children be able to live in a world that is not going into catastrophe, right? And so I think it's our present responsibility and the present needs that we have to meet. And actually there's, I'm sure you all know Whole Foods in the US, and so the founder of Whole Foods, he wrote a book called conscious capitalism, where he talks a lot about sustainability. And Ingrid, what you were saying in terms of the interconnectedness, and that an organization has a responsibility towards society, towards the environment, because we're taking from our environment, we have to give back, and we're like part of an interconnected system. And so that's what I like to think of in terms of sustainability. And also because there was ESG mentioned at the very beginning, we actually, and both you and I kind of differentiate between ESG and sustainability. Maybe you want to briefly talk about that.
ESG has become such a controversial word, and it seems to mean different things to different people. So I think sustainability is definitely a better choice also when you think about business operations of a corporate. So, yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for getting that out of the way. I think it's really important to get clarity around this point. So in today's global market, then, organizations, businesses are affected by a number of risks. Of course, all of the disruptions due to climate change itself, social instability, reputational damage, etc. So how does integrating sustainability into business practices really help these businesses not just survive, stay ahead, but how can it impact the bottom line?
Sure, happy to start. So maybe talking about risk for a second. Like, what do we mean by risk, climate risk, for example? Let's take the floods in Brazil, right? Just happened a few days ago. That causes major disruptions across the entire economy. I think I read an article that said $2.5 billion in economic impact. I think Brazil is reliant heavily on its agriculture. It makes up a fourth of its entire economy. Let's take soybeans, for example. The whole fields are flooded. So what's that impact going to be? It's going to disrupt supply chain, it's going to disrupt operations, everything. And then also, then the banks, right? The banks have to adjust, and the entire system is just affected. And so I don't think we can see climate change as a separate challenge anymore from anything that we do. And organizations have to be able to understand that it's both a physical risk and a transitional risk. We're talking about two different types of risk, right? And that it needs to be mitigated in their own strategies. And there are also human rights risks, right? So I'm sure many of you heard of cases where Nike was accused of not paying their workers. So I think last year there was a case where there were like 4,000 workers somewhere, I think Southeast Asia, who weren't paid. And Nike has been denying these accusations. And that's caused a lot of reputational damage, and that needs to be taken into account as well when it comes to human rights. And so just saying that when we talk about risk, these are some of the examples. I'm sure you have lots of examples as well.
Maybe to your point on climate change and the bottom line, I mean, if you look where we are today, the target was that from 2010 baseline, we should be reducing global emissions by 40% by 2030 and net zero by 2050 to stay at 1.5 degrees. We are nowhere near this. This is not happening. I mean, the planet is burning as we speak. And the unfortunate thing is that it doesn't seem that a lot of attention is being taken into account, either by policymakers or corporates, carbon offsets, etc. It's just prolonging the pain that we are undergoing. Second thing is that if you would actually make the global corporates pay for the pollution that they create, the global profit pool would be wiped out by 40% immediately. So this is something that they're trying to avoid. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have another problem that is becoming extremely and fast, very evident to policymakers, investors, and corporates, and that's the biodiversity loss. We have been so successful in destroying the planet for our consumption and energy needs that in 50 years, we managed to alter 75% of the Earth's surface and 66% of the marine environment. And climate change is just one of the 5 drivers of biodiversity loss. So to Julia's point of what's going on in Brazil today, if you look at the projections, coffee is a big crop for Brazil. by 2050, 60% of all of the coffee producing regions in the world are under threat of disappearing. And this is a byproduct of climate change, biodiversity loss. So if corporates and investors don't start taking into account the impacts and dependencies they have on nature, because we depend on nature for everything, we're going to have some serious issues in the future.
Yeah, 100%. There's one company that we're currently advising, and they're a huge industry group in cement. And so we've had this discussion with them because cement is obviously one of the highest emitting sectors. And they were like, well, what is the choice, right? Either they move out of it, but then who's going to take that on, right? What's going to happen with it? Or they go and look at the risk and also look at how they can decarbonize the industry. And also what the effect of their activities in the cement industry is on biodiversity and mapping that ecosystem. And so what they're doing is looking into new technologies as to how they can reduce the emissions produced from their factories through, this is very technical, but like through the amount of clinker in their cement and other things. And they're really trying to push that forward, and it's not easy, but I think the point is also that we can't just say, oh, these industries are all bad. We have to look at, well, they're going to be there for a while, and how can we decarbonize them, and how can we mitigate the risk? Another risk factor they're talking about is they have a lot of factories near the coastline. So if the sea levels rise, then their factories are going to be affected. So how can they mitigate that, right? How can they build in ways to allow that not to happen? And so I think it's really looking into the future, not just short term, but really long term, what can be done. Yeah.
That's great. And actually building on the biodiversity, could you share a little bit more about your experience and what you've been doing?
So I've been doing it for almost 5 years now, and we launched our first Biodiversity Champions Fund, and we did this in partnership with the Natural History Museum in London, that many of you here may know it as a beautiful building, and everybody just sees it as, you know, one of the best natural history museums in the world, but they actually have 300 scientists that are working below in the lower ground floor, and all of their work is based on biodiversity. They have come up with something called the Biodiversity Intactness Index, which shows you the intactness of biodiversity across 58,000 locations, and they've taken a sample size of 54,000 species across animals, fungi, insects, and plants. And the reading is pretty sad. We should be, if you want to have good biodiversity, you should be above 85. The world is below 70. UK, where I live, is actually close to 60, which is one of the worst records from the developed countries. But what's interesting about this for the corporates, and for instance, you know, your point to the rise of sea levels, that they can use this as a predictive model when they look at their capex, where to allocate the capex, where to put the manufacturing facilities, and you can also use it to ascertain the risks on your supply chain. So that's super interesting. And I'm also part of the International Advisory Panel for Biodiversity Credits. So we have been mandated to come up with a global biodiversity credit scheme by COP16, which hopefully we will, at least with principles, if not with a scheme.
Great, thank you for delving deeper into this. So looking ahead then, what are, in your opinion, the key trends and opportunities really and developments that organizations can take in their stride now?
So I'm a big fan of creating systems change and looking at our world in a more systemic, holistic, and regenerative way. And I think we need to move from tackling symptoms to the root causes. And so right now, even when we look at like sustainability or ESG reporting or all of these things, I think we're still just tackling the symptoms because we're operating, I would say, in a flawed system where the whole system is optimizing for profit maximization, right? So even if companies today were saying, all right, we want to completely shift to the other side, like if they're not going to make money anymore and they might go out of business. And so I think we need to tackle the root cause. We need to design systems in a better way. We need to design governance systems in a better way where, for example, there's an incentivization structure where compensation, for instance, may be tied to certain targets when it comes to sustainability. Because an analogy that I like to make is if we look at our human body, right, we have cells, and a company, it could be a cell, but the cell does not function in isolation. It is in support of the organs, which can be the sectors, and then of the entire body. And so we need to shift the perspective so that companies see that they are part of the whole system and also stand in right relationship to that system. I'm a big fan of, maybe some of you know John Fullerton. So he's a philosopher, economist, and he has presented 8 different principles for a more regenerative economy. And one thing that he talks about is that today, especially when it comes to public companies, the relationship between the owners of the companies and the companies themselves is very distanced, so that there's too little accountability when it comes to actually meeting certain sustainability goals. And so that we need to find a way to close that gap and to go from short-term, all right, let's hit those quarterly goals, to long-term, all right, we're part of this whole system, and if we don't contribute to the system, then the whole world is gonna be affected in a negative way.
Yeah, we could probably spend another couple of hours talking about the problem with the public companies today and investors alike. But I often get asked, like, where is the problem? Because everybody thinks everything is okay. You know, we can walk out of here now and go for lunch and have Chinese, Indian, Mexican people in day-to-day life don't really seem to understand the problem. It's still a little bit behind the scenes. But the way that it works, and to Julia's point about all of the, you know, if you want to call it cellular interconnectedness, just to put it into a simple description of where the world is today, 50% of all the habitable land is used for agriculture. But out of this land that is used for agriculture, for the production of crops, it's not for humans, it's actually for livestock. So today, the breakdown of the big mammals in the world is that 94% is livestock, only 6% is wildlife. And this is also a byproduct of the extinction rates, where in some cases we managed to reduce the natural extinction rate from 1,000 years to 10 years, which is absolutely appalling. So we are practically engaging in more deforestation, losing natural carbon sinks, to produce food for livestock. Every year, if you didn't know, on average, we kill 80 billion animals for our consumption, and that excludes chickens. And these animals, in 98% of the cases, are industrially reared, full of steroids, hormones, and antibiotics, hugely stressed. This is why you have such a high incidence of non-communicable diseases, which today account for 70% of all the global diseases. You have problems with AMR, that, you know, unless you're really interested, you wouldn't know about this and look into it. And then 40% of all of this food ends as waste. So this is how the world is functioning today, and this is why we are where we are. So to your point, what needs to change? Unfortunately, there is one word, and that is more regulation, because the carrot approach so far hasn't really functioned. We have to move to the stick approach, and we have to start pricing the externalities in a way that, you know, whether it's using people or using the environment in an unsustainable way, is not going to be seen as a winning business model any longer.
Thank you. Really good point there. Are there opportunities for companies to go beyond compliance and really add and do something to create a regenerative future?
I think that comes down to the management, and I think where you see management doing, sustainability because of the want to make the world a better place is actually a company you want to invest in, and it's a sign of a forward-looking and proper management that is looking both at risk but also at opportunities into account. And there are many companies that actually came into existence that 20 years ago that today are public companies, and their whole company strategy is based around saving the planet and providing these alternative materials to reduce the damage that we are doing to the planet.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think when I also look at the types of companies that we work with, the ones that I get mostly excited about are those that know that they might be in an industry that is not the best industry currently, but they have a willingness to turn a risk into an opportunity. And actually that phrase, turning a risk into an opportunity, comes up over and over again, because it's like, if we don't do anything, then that's a huge risk the company can go down. If we manage to turn this around, for instance, with the cement company, if we manage to decarbonize cement, then that will create a trickle effect across the whole industry and actually help everybody in the industry, right? But then we also have those on the other side who are like, almost on the climate denying side. It was like, well, we just have to comply, and if we comply, then everything's going to be fine, right? Almost like not trying to see what goes beyond that. And so, yeah, it's all about that mindset. And I think those that end up being affected, like with the floods in Brazil, I'm sure that is a wake-up call to a lot of people who are like, okay, it's not just a far-fetched concept anymore, it's right in front of their door. And if they don't do anything, then it's going to be a very bad outcome.
That's great, thank you. Do you have any examples of organizations? I think you mentioned one before with the cement, but do you have any other companies that really stand out in your opinion?
One of my favorite companies is a US company that was set up in the 80s. It's a manufacturer of composite decking, and in 20 years they've come to account for 6% of the US market share. And their whole strategy is based around preserving and helping biodiversity. So they're the second largest recycler of plastic bags in the United States today, and the wood that they use is only reclaimed wood. So obviously they're helping to reduce the pollution that goes into oceans, into the landfills. But the most interesting thing about it is the actual longevity of the product itself, which is in excess of 25 years. If you take your average wood decking, it's only 10 years. So it's actually the systems change that Julia was talking about earlier in terms of reducing the consumption of materials. And this is a business, they just had a capital markets day in October last year, where they will be growing at 20% for the next 3 years in terms of the top line. And they're looking at the margin expansion in excess of 500 bips. So, a winning model that is great for the planet.
Great.
And actually love this topic specifically about plastic waste, because we had invested in a company that tackles this by working with large corporations. So they are creating a truly scalable plastic-free leather alternative, which is already being used in BMW cars. They have a Chanel, Stella McCartney, H&M collection. Loads of companies are using them. And they're doing it so that it's scalable and so that those larger companies can actually adopt it and go away from using toxic materials. And so just wanted to add that I think that's the future, and also really going for a more circular, closed-loop system.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much for the contribution. So if we could just summarize a little bit, what are the main takeaways then from this session? Ingrid, do you want to start?
Sustainability shouldn't be an option, it should be a must. And this is just for the future survival of corporates. There are so many risks, whether it's supply chain, whether it's a regulation. In Europe we have the EU deforestation policy coming. In a couple of years we have the CSDDD, which is due diligence directive, which is extremely draconian. If you don't comply, you will be fined 5% of your revenues. You won't be able to operate in Europe. Some call it that Europe is becoming anti-competitive. I would say Europe is becoming forward-looking. The unfortunate thing is that money is global, so regulation should also be harmonized on a global level, and hopefully that's something that will come. In terms of nature, I'll just leave you with one thought, and biodiversity. When you go out of the building, deep in take a deep breath and look around you, because the biggest mistake that we have made as humans is thinking that nature is something that is permanent, and it's not. It's just another resource that we have been exploiting without an end, and it's a resource that is becoming more scarce by the day.
Yeah, I'd say from my side, the main takeaway is to look at ourselves and our companies as part of the system, which very much ties into your last point, to remember that analogy of our own bodies, and that only through looking at the world in a systemic way can we truly tackle challenges like climate change, like biodiversity loss and other things, because otherwise we're in almost like in a hamster wheel. We are stuck in this system that is flawed in itself, that no matter what we do, we can't seem to break out of it. We have to shift the system. And I think that starts with embedding systemic thinking into your own organizations, and to see, all right, let's not just look at a problem in an isolated manner and a solution in an isolated manner, but how is that affecting everything around it? I think that would be from my side.
Great. Well, thank you both for such valuable insights, and enjoy the rest of the GreenTech conference. Thank you.
It's time to wake up.